Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 32 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Be sure to check out my Patreon for next week's episode, now available. You can check out the links below. Now let's get to the story. Recovering her senses, Janir grabbed Karile and tackled him to the ground. "Do you want them to see us?" Karile rolled his eyes. "I was about to say much the same thing to you." They laid in the dead grass, peering between the crunching stalks. The dwarves worked dutifully, never even nodding to one another. The humming was singing in their guttural tongue at the top of their lungs. They did everything to the beat of the song, whether it was bringing down their hammers, grabbing the next section of rope. The song had an eerie, rumbling lilt that made Janir think of thunder in the heart of the earth. At least a dozen overseers and soldiers, slavish from the look of them, were posted at odd intervals, surveying the dwarves' work. Most of the slavish stood with their arms folded across their chests and woolen cloaks bundled around their shoulders. It was much cooler here than in the Slavish plains. "Who do you think that is?" Karile wondered, pointing to the group of horsemen making their way along the road. One of the riders carried a standard decorated with a white sunburst. "Whose standard is that?" "It seems familiar," Janir trailed off. She didn't remember exactly where she had seen the symbol before. She stared intently after the group of riders. One of the horsemen dismounted, probably a lord by his fine raiment, and strode toward a dwarf that appeared to be keeping count on a scroll in his meaty fists. The lord seemed to ask something. The dwarf replied. It was impossible to hear what they were saying. Without any warning that Janir could see, the lord backhanded the dwarf across the face, sending the small man sprawling in the dirt. Janir cringed, thinking how much that must have hurt. The dwarves' song came to an abrupt halt. Every dwarf within sight of the Slavish lord glared in his direction. Several dwarves scrambled to help their companion, but not one made a move toward the Slavish lord. Not even one voice rose against him. The last time Janir had encountered dwarves, an elf had bumped one of them in a marketplace, and the offended dwarf had returned to pummel the elf with shovels and the fists of several friends. Granted that elves were the especial enemies of dwarves, but this behavior was so drastically different from what Janir had seen before. "Karile, we need to go." 5 more minutes. Janir twisted around and edged in the opposite direction of the dwarves through the tall grasses. Janir shoved the grass stalks aside and crawled onward. "Where are you going?" Karile demanded. "Home." Karile sighed. "Wait for me." He scooted after her. It was actually working. They crawled until they were far enough down the side of the ridge that no one would see them. Janir rose and brushed off her skirt before making her way back down the slope to Paulrun. The gelding had lowered his head into the grass and tore it up in mouthfuls. He hadn't seen them approach until they were a few paces away, and a sudden strong gust caught Karile's robe. Paulrun's head shot up in terror, and he let off a shrill whinny of fright. Janir froze instinctively. She didn't see how anyone on the other side of the ridge hadn't heard that. Paulrun's head shot up in terror, and he let off a shrill whinny of fright. Janir froze instinctively. She didn't see how anyone on the other side of the ridge hadn't heard that, but she passionately prayed that they would just think it the wind or a wild pony or something. The gelding realized it was only Karile and eyed the enchanter warily. Janir had hopes that no one had noticed, until a replying neigh from one of the Slavish horses sounded from the far side of the ridge. Janir raced toward Paulrun and tried to unlash the animal from the sapling, but haste made her fingers clumsy and the horse sensed her anxiety, pulling back on the reins, tightening the otherwise simple knot. Janir grew desperate and yanked until the sapling's branches snapped. She hastily picked out the stray fragments of branches and untangled the leather straps best she could before swinging them over Paulrun's head. On the ridge, 3 small figures silently appraised the intruders. The dwarves turned and appeared to shout back to the others, and in a matter of heartbeats, there were a dozen others barreling toward them with improvised weapons, shovels and pickaxes. It didn't matter if the dwarves were only armed with shovels. Janir had seen that they were just as dangerous with digging tools as an elf was with a sword. Why had she not brought her carcotton? Not that it would have done much good. This entire errand suddenly seemed like a remarkably stupid means of avoiding a few uncomfortable conversations. If there was any upside, it was that the dwarves were chasing them and not the horsemen. Janir vaulted onto the gelding's back. Paulrin sidestepped uneasily, eyeing the oncoming group of dwarves with trepidation. Karile nearly slammed into the side of the horse, then sprang up behind her. She pointed their mount in the direction of Castle Caerson and sank her heels into the gelding's sides. Paulrin was only too happy to oblige and took off in a hard gallop. Janir tried to steer Paulrin around the loose rocks scattered along the mountainside as best she could. Normally, she probably would have descended the slope at a cautious walking pace, letting the horse pick his way on his own. But having a band of dwarves behind them changed the situation. Janir refused to look back, even though she could hear the dwarves shouting in their native tongue. She was scared enough. The horse stumbled, and Janir was certain for one terrible moment that he would roll, crushing her and Karile. But at the last instant, Paulrin managed to compensate and recover his balance. At last they reached the base of the hill, and the more reliable footing of the forest. Paulrin snorted as Janir urged him on faster along a narrow game path. She dared to look back. The dwarves practically flew after them, faster than Janir had thought anyone on 2 legs could run. Paulrin's hooves pounded against the ground, breath coming in rhythm to his strides. Not all the horses of Castle Caerson were in as good condition as Kalbo. "You know, they run pretty fast for little guys," Karile shouted. "Why are they chasing us?" Janir whipped a gaze over her shoulder in time to see the dwarves vaulting over a fallen log. "We didn't do anything to them." She angled Paulrin toward the edge of the tree line. The gelding was more resistant to her command than Kalbo would have been, but begrudgingly obeyed. "They can't risk being discovered," Karile shouted. "They're too vulnerable." The dwarves weren't fast enough to keep pace with the horse, but Paulrin was panicked. He was being chased, and his prey animal instincts told him if he didn't escape, he would be eaten. Even though they were outstripping their hunters, the dwarves made so much noise with their shouting and crashing through the underbrush that if one were just listening, one might have thought otherwise. Janir was losing control of the gelding. He didn't have the trust for her that Kalbo did. The horse burst headlong from the trees and nearly ran into a man in the humble clothes of a tradesman, with a tethered hawk perched on his arm. The royal hawking party had wandered far from the castle, most likely in search of the best quarry for the birds. At Janir and Karile's sudden appearance aboard a terrified horse, everyone scrambled clear of Paulrin's flying hooves. The hawk keepers instinctively shielded their charges, the tethered and blindfolded hawks on their gloved arms. Janir hauled on the reins as a last resort and just barely managed to keep Paulrin from plowing over a woman in a blue dress that might very well have been the queen herself. The gelding pulled back on his hind legs and reared, neighing in terror. Karile plummeted to the ground with a thud as Janir struggled to control the animal. Paulrin's front end slammed back into the earth and sent Janir lurching onto his neck. The horse jerked sideways, sending Janir over his shoulder. Someone caught Paulrin's bridle, and the gelding at least stopped lashing out. Janir had fallen off a horse many times before and was used to it, but it always hurt. She clambered to her feet slowly, taking careful inventory of her bruises and scrapes. "Janir, are you all right?" Armandius was at her side a moment later. "Yes, father," Janir panted, smearing grass and dirt off her bodice. "And I'm fine too," Karile put in, clambering to his feet and dusting his robe. "Just in case anybody cares." "Was something chasing you?" Seovan was quick to ask the obvious. Janir turned and saw that the elf had caught the horse's bridle. She should have known. Few mortals could have calmed an animal like that. "Dwarves," she gasped, the words sounding outlandish even to her own ears. "You have a great deal of nerve, young woman, crashing in here and disrupting our outing." One of the High Queen's ladies-in-waiting, not Gwenna, screeched. One of the Queen's knights had to comment too. "Lord Caerson, if you cannot control your daughter." Janir didn't pay attention to the rest of what was said, and nor did Armandius. Fortunately, neither the queen, or any of the queen's knights, or the other ladies-in-waiting knew about her heritage, unless Lady Gwenna had told them, and Janir highly doubted that. "Dwarves this far north?" Queen Liaris demanded, one eyebrow arching. "That is too far off the regular trade routes." That statement seemed strikingly out of character for her, but Janir didn't have the chance to ponder it. "Janir, why would dwarves chase you?" Armandius gave her his full attention. "Could you be mistaken?" "No, really. We found them in the hills with slavish overseers, and they're trying to kill us." The thunder of dwarves crashing through the underbrush interrupted her explanation. The first dwarf to burst from the greenery, shovel at the ready, skidded to a stop a few paces from the trees and blinked in surprise, eliciting gasps of shock from the queen and most of her ladies-in-waiting. Janir spotted Gwenna watching the dwarf serenely. She was rarely unsettled. Several others followed after the first dwarf, and all of them stopped short beside him. The queen's knights drew their swords and prepared to defend their queen. Armandius drew his enchanted blade, the third. The queen's knights were required to carry weapons at all times when on duty, and Armandius, according to tradition, was never without the third. But Seovan was bound by neither protocol or tradition in this case, and had left his sword at the castle. He caught Janir's arm, pulling her back, never once taking his eyes off the little men with their improvised weapons. It was Armandius who spoke first. "What do you want?" The dwarves didn't answer. They muttered amongst themselves in their native tongue. Then one shouted to the others, and like that, the dwarves charged back in the direction they had come from. Several queen's knights instinctively made to give chase, but Armandius stopped them. "No, you'd never catch them. Besides, we should get the women back to the castle before we hunt anything." "Wars are won by swift and decisive actions," one of the queen's knights, a man in his early to mid-20s, put in. It was only one comment, but Armandius must have sensed underlying rebellion. "I know, young man. I was leading armies before you learned to handle a blade. And I say that we will take the women back to safety. Or would you like to explain to High King Remian how his wife came to harm on your watch?" The knight backed down at that. Armandius commanded everyone to mount their horses. The animals had been tethered a short distance away, so had to be fetched, and their girths had to be tightened. The hawkmasters clambered aboard their sturdy mules, and the noblewomen were helped up to sit side-saddle on their palfreys. Janir glimpsed Armandius helping Gwenna onto her mount, but gave it no more thought. Janir gingerly took Paulrin's reins back from Seovan. A pause passed between them. "Are you all right?" Seovan asked, plucking a leaf from her sleeve. Janir swallowed, nodding. "I am glad of it. Come, we must be going." The elf went to the horse he was borrowing. Janir waited as he tightened the horse's girth and slipped the reins over its head. The sun had come out just a little, and a few rays cast shadows over his clavicle, showing beneath his mussed collar. She wasn't sure why she was staring at him, but she liked doing it. "Shall I ride with you again?" Karile came up behind her. "What?" "Yes. At least, I can hardly imagine anyone else being willing to take you." "Ha ha," Karile said mirthlessly. There was no wind here, and Karile's robe had stopped snapping like a flag in a storm. Janir gathered the reins and mounted Paulrin, making sure that the animal was again comfortable with Karile before she let the enchanter swing up behind her. "Can I say it?" Karile asked. "What?" "I mean, it is true." "What?" "Okay, I'm going to say it." "What?" Janir contemplated pushing him off and letting him walk home. "I told you so," Karile crowed. Janir refused to dignify that with a response. She spurred their mount into a canter after the lead rider, with Armandius following not far behind, and Seovan somewhere in the throng. She could feel his presence, that dappled Aurelian light. It was reassuring. It made her feel safe. They reached Castle Caerson about an hour later, where Janir handed Paulrin's reins back to a stable boy. She didn't blame the horse for the problems they had had that day. But most of it would never have happened if she had been riding Colbo. Armandius immediately had a page run to fetch Brophy, Derek, the captain of the guard, and Dame Celila. Janir overheard the queen saying to Gwenna as they were helped off their horses, All this, and the birds only caught one rabbit. Such a shame." The Argatolan maiden was coming to dislike the queen more with every word the woman spoke. "We were fortunate," Gwenna countered. "The dwarves could have caused us great harm if they had decided to attack." Janir didn't mean to be eavesdropping, but they weren't making any effort to mute their conversation. But their fear of Brevian warriors turned them back." Another woman, probably the same one who had been scolding Janir earlier, put in. "Afraid?" Gwenna repeated. "No, they were not afraid. They did not make the decision to turn back fearfully." Liaris pulled Gwenna to the side as the rest of their companions went on with their chattering. The two of them were too far away for Janir to make out their words, but the queen's perpetually insipid smile vanished. They spoke for a handful of breaths before facing the other ladies again. The moment Liaris turned back to her entourage, her usual guise had returned. Janir puzzled for a moment. Deciding that there was no reason for her to accompany Her Majesty and her ladies-in-waiting into the castle keep, Janir headed straight for Kalbo to see that his stall was in order. He nickered at the sight of her and nibbled on her hair affectionately. Janir closed her eyes and pressed her forehead against his sleek neck. Dwarves, Slavish, Rhodes, Argatolums. She breathed in and pictured an empty meadow. She was all alone in that meadow, nothing but Kalbo and the sunlight and Seovan walking next to her. "Janir." Armandius marched in her direction. She realized that she should have gone to see him and give him a report of what she had seen, but perhaps she was so used to letting him handle everything that she hadn't thought of it. "Where did you find the dwarves?" he asked, skipping straight to business. "About a mile from where we ran into you, toward the mountains. There were about 50 of them, all workers, not warriors." Armandius scoffed. "Saying that a dwarf isn't a warrior is like saying an elf doesn't speak to animals." Janir felt rebuked. "Anyway, they were rebuilding the road, just as the rumors said. They had Slavish overseers, about 50 soldiers, and this man rode up. I think he was a lord. He rode under the pennant of a white sunburst, and he struck the dwarf I think was in command. But no one even raised their voice at him." "Really?" Armandius seemed as surprised as she had been. "A sunburst? That would be the house of Vonmar." "Vonmar?" For a moment, that one name seemed to be the only thought in her mind. The Vonmars, Bryson's family, Lucan's kin. Janir wondered if her foster father remembered. He didn't appear to, or had she even mentioned it to him? "Yes. This behavior on the dwarves' part is most odd indeed." Armandius appeared to consider something for a moment. "Very well. Don't go riding in the mountains again until I tell you that it's safe." His warning had been unnecessary, but Janir nodded. Armandius marched away, undoubtedly to speak with Derek and Brothy. Janir leaned against the door to Kalbo's stall. Her horse eventually turned to nibbling at the dry hay in his manger, keeping one soft brown eye on her. Why would the Vonmars need the road rebuilt? The apparent answer was to bring an army through the mountains. Why would the dwarves be helping the Vonmars? That was a mystery. In addition to what she had seen with her own eyes, it was common knowledge that dwarves were notoriously defiant. There was a very old dwarvish saying that went, "I bow to no one but my God and my king." Even though she was loath to even think about it, the Argatolums and the Vonmars were allied for the coming war. Again she wondered, did her father know she was still alive? Where she was? If Lucan had survived his injuries, it was conceivable that he might have reached Adasha months ago. She shuddered at the idea of the Lord Argatolum. The girl yanked a few stray strands of hay from a sheave in the aisle of the stable and knotted them together in her fingers. Grooms and stable boys moved buckets and poured oats in the stalls around her. Another thought occurred to her. What if, after hearing Lucan's account of Janir, the Lord Argatolum decided that Lucan should be his true heir? Shuddering at the memory, Janir recalled Kamek, the Morton who had said she was no true Argatolum. He'd seen her as nothing more than a slave and tried to force himself on her to prove it. What if the Lord Argatolum saw her as just that, a shameful weakling to be culled? What if he sent assassins after her? What if the Lord Argatolum decided to kill Armandius? What if? You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.